I'm not trying to be the most bullish. I just, or trying to be the most moon boy. It's like, it's literally just, as ironic as it is, it's from my risk averse opinion. Like, if this thing is as low risk as it seems in comparison to everything else, the value should be orders of magnitude more than everything else combined. So that's the whole reason that the bullishness is the great irony, is that Bitcoin, if we're correct, is lower risk and higher upside than everything else. But the probability of a fractional reserve system deteriorating to zero is inherently higher than a full reserve system. If you're violating the laws of physics, it's inevitable that something has to give. Bitcoin should, in my opinion, become only more volatile in the future because the rate of technological change is only getting faster, the rate at which fractional reserve systems trend to zero is only getting faster, and the rate at which the marginal cost of energy production is going to zero is only becoming faster.
Introducing the Blockware Marketplace. Start mining Bitcoin today. This has the potential to transform the mining industry, as now anyone can buy a Bitcoin ASIC using on-chain or Lightning, see its historical and live hash rate before purchasing, and be earning Bitcoin mining rewards in minutes. This brings transparency and turnkey mining to a whole other level. Start mining Bitcoin today at marketplace.blockwaresolutions.com. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Blockware Intelligence Podcast. This week I have on Luke Broyles once again. Luke, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be back. And on one hand, it's not been very long, but on the other hand, a lot's happened the last couple of months. So
Yeah,
both with me personally, but then much more importantly with the world as a whole. So thanks for having me back. Yeah, this is gonna be. I'm really looking forward to this.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm trying to remember, when did we record the first episode? Was it last year or was it early 2023 still?
No, it was early this year. I think your podcast was the first podcast I did uh, at all regarding Bitcoin. And since then, I've done Preston Pish's podcast. I've started my own podcast. I have a couple episodes of that out now. Hoping to do more in the next couple weeks. With let's see, Foss and Jeff Booth and Jason from Thank God. And anyway, so yeah, I've been around a bit on the shows, but you're my first one, so I figured you should be. You asked me if I wanted to come back, and I was like, why not? So, and plus I had questions for you too, so I'm hoping to learn a little bit from you during this. So yeah.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, I mean, love to have you on. The first episode obviously did amazing, and I think let's just jump right into it because I'm sure the audience wants to hear
Yeah.
what you have to say. I think starting off, we can go with what's kind of happening in the banking system right now. We saw First Republic, which I think someone said was like the 13th largest U.S. bank. We saw their stock price get obliterated. I think it was on Tuesday or maybe today, Wednesday. Can you like contrast or explain maybe like what's going on and maybe contrast the dollar system with the Bitcoin system?
Yeah, sure. I'm really glad you asked me. I tweeted that, as it was happening or just after closing hours or whatever yesterday. And people liked it. But anyway, I hope your editor puts up my tweet with the chart because the chart is just mind blowing. It might be the 14th largest bank, it's 13th or 14th. It's up there somewhere. It's a major bank. It's not one of the big four, but it's a major one. So yeah, obviously since our last recording, we had last month in March, we had the Silicon Valley Bank and the other two banks or whatever. And then we had the FDIC issue in response to that. So the first big problem was Silicon Valley Bank and the banking crisis that was beginning to unfold. It was like 2008 level, more or less. Basically, if it continued on, it would have been. It wasn't at first, but anyway, so it was a big problem. Number one. Number two, we decided to basically throw up the table with the FDIC, and then number three, we basically reversed half a year of quantitative tightening in a couple weeks. That the Fed did. So that was a third big thing that happened within those couple weeks, and now we have this fourth thing. It seems of First Public Bank that yesterday decided, just I'm gonna head out. So yeah, it completely crashed. I don't know how far the stock's down, but it's like almost irrelevant to say. It's like 99, 98, 99.9, It's basically just collapsed. And the funny thing, Joe, is that on Twitter, even though I was very critical of when the Silicon Valley Bank was happening, what the Fed was doing, FDIC, and now this, it's like it's been amazing to me how there's been so much. I mean, granted, there's a lot of positive feedback of people that agree with me, but there's been a lot of negative response to that, saying that, oh, your time preference is too short. Oh, that's just short term or whatever. Because for those that perhaps haven't been aware, Bitcoin has more or less doubled in the same period of time. And I'll get into why that is. I think it's probably self-evident, but point being that the people that are anti-Bitcoin and the people that think Bitcoin's a scam have really come out of the woodwork since the beginning of these banking troubles over the last 60 days or so, 60, 90 days. Actually, no, not even that. What, 45 days? And they've really, like, oh, it's too short time preference. You're using the last 5 days to judge everything. You're using this banking crisis to judge everything, blah, blah, blah. And it's been really frustrating, Joe, frankly. I just live my life, whatever, I don't care, but yeah, I have my convictions. But it's so illogical because, they're saying you can't judge last week, you can't judge the whole health of the global financial system on the last week, and you can't judge one bank for them all, blah, 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 blah. And the funny thing is that they spend so little time following my account and they spend so little time listening to my podcast or hearing my perspective that it's like I'm one of the lowest time preference people on Twitter. It's like half of my threads I'm talking about, 100 years from now, 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, which granted they're all speculations, but it's like it's so funny to me when people accuse me of being a short-term minded, profit taker or whatever, where it's like the whole Bitcoin thesis is about risk aversion. And so that was one of my tweets yesterday about the First Republic Bank, was about how what ultimately at the root of it is going on here. I did not predict Silicon Valley Bank. I did not predict First Republic Bank. I'm not that smart. I'm not in those boards. Like I'm not claiming that. But what I am claiming, what I am saying, what I've been saying for a long time, both on Twitter and off Twitter, my personal life, is that fractional reserve systems have to decline back to zero sooner or later. Now, that can happen via nominal terms or that can happen via real terms, but one way or another, if there is a fractional reserve system, meaning something that's creating value out of thin air, or in biblical terms, something that is reaping without sowing, or in physics terms, something that's breaking the law of conservation of energy, or in cryptography terms, something that's violating double spend problem. It's like all these things are saying the same thing. It's when you create something out of nothing, aka fractional reserve, it's inevitable that it has to correct back to where it started with, like a full circle. And so it's really that simple, I would say, is that every fractional reserve system sooner or later has to return to its baseline reality. And if the fractional reserve has been so great that the baseline is zero, then it returns to zero. And so that's what happened with FTX last year. People like to criticize Bitcoin. It's like because of the FTX thing, and it's like it's the exact same thing. I was telling people, get out of FTT token, get out of FTX, because it's a fractional reserve system. Sam Bankman-Fried's fractional reserve crypto exchange, and they just kept lending and lending and lending, and it collapsed. It collapsed to zero overnight. And it's the same thing that happened with Silicon Valley Bank. I know not the same thing, but it's the same idea of a fractional reserve, and it's the same idea with what's just happened with First Republic Bank. Again, I hope your editors put up my tweet, because my whole point in that tweet is saying that our human psychology, our human minds are risk averse, and they should be, because our brains, we're not supposed to touch hot stoves, we're not supposed to play with guns, we're supposed to be risk averse, biologically, because against asymmetric downside. And so we're very concerned about buying Bitcoin, even if it's $100, or even if it's 1% of our assets. Because what if it goes to zero? It's so small, it's so new. What if it dies? What if it crashes? The chart that is First Republic Bank, that chart is what people fear with Bitcoin. They fear that it's going to be 30,000 and then boom, it's just going to gap down to zero or something. That's what they fear. That's what everyone fears when it comes to Bitcoin, because they see altcoins do that. They say FTX do that. Ponzi schemes in the past do it. That's what they see, and so that's what they assume is the worst case scenario. But the whole point, the whole thesis, the whole idea I've been putting out there is that fractional reserve systems trend to zero forever against full reserve systems. Maybe in the short term, fractional reserves go up in value, but long term, a full reserve system is inherently worth more. And so, point being that the irony is that humans think Bitcoin is that thing that could go to zero because it's small in comparison to banks, and in comparison to central banks, in comparison to the bond market, in comparison to First Republic Bank or Silicon Valley Bank. And so we assume those things are safer because they're bigger, whereas the whole point is that it is lower risk to have your energy placed in a smaller full reserve system than a large fractional reserve system, because it's the exact thing that just happened with First Republic Bank. And the horrible irony in that is that people, in trying to avoid risk and avoiding Bitcoin and listening to their financial advisors give advice on something that they haven't done the work on, the unfortunate reality is that they lose more money, like in real time. Like the S&P 500, and this was one of my comments in my tweet, was that the S&P 500 went down 1.4%, 1.2, it went down over 1% yesterday, the S&P 500, which all in all isn't that bad. But the irony is that if you own the S&P 500, you were exposed to that spike down from First Republic Bank yesterday. That's one of the stocks and the S&P 500, and boom, it's gone. So yes, you're diversifying the S&P 500, and that's a good thing to be diversified if you're thinking from that mindset. But the Bitcoin mindset is, this is a full reserve system, and right now you're diversified in a large series of fractional reserve systems, or systems that are, or companies and assets and securities that are exposed to fractional reserves, and you have to diversify into a full reserve system to protect all your exposure in these full reserve systems. And so, sorry, I've been going on a lot, but the great irony is that people will not even take a 5% allocation to Bitcoin, or a 3% allocation, or 1% allocation to Bitcoin, because they're so terrified of losses of 1%, when it's like your S&P 500 moves up and down 1% any given day. Bitcoin's up 4% the last 5 days. The S&P 500 is down like 2% the last 5 days, which, yes, Twitter, I understand. You should not base your financial decisions on the last 5 days. But the point was that, in my mind, it's inexcusable to have anything under 5% is a good place to start. I guess I'll put it that way. But the more important thing is to get off zero. And 5% is so logical because most people have massive exposure to fractional reserve systems. And most people are so ignorant, for lack of a better word, perhaps uneducated or unread, or I don't know, what's a more respectful word to say, but people don't know all the risk that is there. That's the point I'm trying to make. And as counterintuitive as it sounds, Bitcoin is lower risk in those things because it can't gap down like that as long as it remains fully reserved. And it's remained fully reserved for 14 years. It's audited every 10 minutes, and there's zero individuals that could violate that. So it's some unknown that could turn it into a fractional reserve. So anyway, it made my point, but the larger point being that the last 5 days and the last 50 days have been nothing but validation that you have to have exposure to a full reserve system in case the fractional reserve spirals out of control. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that was well said. I mean, a lot of people, think that their 401k or their S&P 500 index fund is fairly safe, but you're right. Like, it's composed of things like First Republic Bank, where it's like that can literally gap down, very fast and trend towards zero even faster than Bitcoin can, and even during its bear markets. And so it's crazy to think that there's risk everywhere, right? There's risk with just about anything you do. There's risk in life, but First Republic, other banks, other, large institutions within the US, there's plenty of risk there. And Bitcoin is this one system where it's like, it's very difficult to change it. We know pretty confidently that 10 years it's going to still be working, 20 years it's going to still be working, 100 years it's going to still be working. And as long as it's still working and the 21 million supply cap still exists, then it's going to be a better system than something like the dollar system, which we know there can be short periods of time where, less dollars can exist, like M2 can go down, but that's not very sustainable. That's eventually going to reverse its trend, and it's going to go back to its normal exponential growth of dollars because that's how the entire system functions. You have to create more and more debt to create more and more dollars to sustain that, 2% or 5% or 8% CPI inflation. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think you're spot on there.
Yeah, and if I could add something to that, is that, it's like people think that sometimes people have the false impression that I'm predicting, oh, hyperinflation in the United States of America. And it's like, that's not even the point. The point is that it's possible. And so, yeah, I don't think hyperinflation is going to happen in the United States or perhaps even Europe with the euro, perhaps not ever, or perhaps not for a long time. Perhaps, we all go extinct and die first. But the fact it's possible is the whole point. And I've looked very long and hard, you have too, but we can't yet find a way at which that occurs for Bitcoin. And so even if Bitcoin does hyperinflate, die, and collapse or whatever, let's say it's possible. Bitcoiners don't like it when I say that, but let's say it's theoretically possible. Let's say there's a 1% chance that occurs. Like, we know from history that these fiat currencies have an extremely high probability of hyperinflation, and we've already seen multiple like happening now. You have where Nigeria, Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Argentina, especially the last couple of weeks, and then Venezuela, Zimbabwe, all those examples. But yeah, point being that it's like I think people think that Bitcoiners are absolutists, and perhaps we are, but even if you're not an absolutist, to me it's obvious because the probability of a fractional reserve system deteriorating to zero is inherently higher than a full reserve system. And this isn't a political stance. This isn't an anti-USA stance. This has nothing to do with this being America. This has nothing to do with the political aisle. It's just, as Foss would say, it's just math, or Saylor would say, it's just energy. And if you're violating the laws of physics, it's inevitable that something has to give. So, yeah.
Yeah, another thing going off First Republic that I think is interesting is the downside volatility in First Republic is well deserved, right? Like there's actual risk that their liabilities exceed their assets, right? And that's what basically why a bank run occurs. Whereas you contrast that with Bitcoin's volatility, Bitcoin goes up in these parabolic
Mhm.
bull runs and then it falls the 80% or the 85% or the 70% that Bitcoin does. And it's not like Bitcoin is falling because its liabilities are greater than its assets. Like it doesn't have a balance sheet. It's still 21 million Bitcoin. The monetary properties are still the same. The core principles of why Bitcoin is better money than dollars, gold, raised stones, salt, glass beads, whatever, those properties still exist. And the volatility is just due to its rapid adoption. And then it got overextended and now it's like falling back
Yeah.
down. So I kind of want to get your thoughts on Bitcoin's hyperbolic adoption. What do you think there?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a great question. I think, yeah, bridging the gap there, most people view Bitcoin volatility as inherently risky because they're used to thinking of volatility in terms of stocks. If a stock is super volatile, like First Republic Bank, it's because you have these major shifts in assets versus liabilities, or they had a horrible earnings release, or this, that, whatever. But the difference with Bitcoin, or with any commodity for that matter, is that there's no cash flows, there's no CEO, there's no yield, there's no liability. It's like all these things, they're different. And so, yes, to your point, Bitcoin's volatile and then it goes down and up just like stocks. But the difference is that it can't have its debt obligations or it can't lose a customer because, it's different because it's not a security. And so that's true to the downside. Like that's the point I've been making thus far, but it's also true to the upside, to the question point you're making there, that we inherently think it's the same to the downside, and so we also inherently assume that there's only a certain amount it can go up. We think like, oh, well, stocks, like say Apple or Amazon or whatever, like, well, they can go up 100x or 10x. So yeah, maybe Bitcoin could go up 10x or 100x too. Maybe it goes from 30,000 to 300,000 someday, or maybe someday in the far, far future, maybe $3 million, if it's going to be the next big thing, like how Apple was the next big thing. And I believe that's flawed logic because I believe, again, conversing the downside instead of the upside, I think it's the same thing. I think Bitcoin is much more resilient against downside than stocks. Give me one stock that's crashed 80% 4 times now in the last 10 years and recovered every single time. Like, you can't. I'm pretty confident of that. Maybe there's one minor penny stock that's an exception, and I'm sure someone will find it and then hate on me for that. But point being that because it's fully reserved, every time there's a downside, it doesn't gap down to zero. And because it's fully reserved, when it makes that new all-time high, when there's new adoption, it could go significantly higher than what other systems can because they can't sustain either the downside or the upside volatility, and Bitcoin can. So, yeah, your precise question, I think, about adoption cycles. Yeah, I think Bitcoin will continue to be volatile, and people that buy Bitcoin should know it'll continue to be volatile. And this will probably offend people, but whatever. I think Bitcoin will only become more volatile. And I think a lot of people don't think that. They think, oh, someday Bitcoin will mature and then it will lose volatility. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Bitcoin should, in my opinion, become only more volatile in the future because the rate of technological change is only getting faster. The rate at which fractional reserve systems trend to zero is only getting faster. And the rate at which the marginal cost of energy production is going to zero is only becoming faster. And so if we assume those things, and the total number of net humans in the world is becoming volatile. There are more humans. I mean, we have larger populations. So point being that as the world gets faster, like Bitcoin should only get more volatile. Maybe there are brief periods where it's not, but I think a hyperbolic curve is very probable. So yeah, I think someone buying Bitcoin today should fully expect it to go up 10x in price in a very short period of time, and then expect it to crash 50, 60, 70% of the time. Again, if you're measuring it in terms of US dollars, if you're measuring it in terms of 1 Bitcoin equals 1 Bitcoin, then it's never volatile. But yeah, anyway, that's just some ramblings of mine. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. I know you've been talking to Peter Dunworth, who beat you on the most bullish Blockware Intelligence podcast ever recorded, and because you originally held that title. Have you been talking to Peter? Like, what have you guys been talking about? What is your take on his extremely bullish
Yeah.
future for Bitcoin? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I guess first of all, it's not a competition. I'm not trying to be the most bullish. I just or trying to be the most moon boy. It's like it's literally just as ironic as it is, it's from my risk averse opinion. Like if this thing is as low risk as it seems in comparison to everything else, its value should be orders of magnitude more than everything else combined. So that's the whole reason that the bullishness is the great irony is that Bitcoin, if we're correct, is lower risk and higher upside than everything else, which is what makes it so obvious and so mind blowing. People don't take at least a 1% allocation or 5%. But anyway, it's not a competition. But Peter, he has price. I don't know if he would call them price targets, but he has very high numbers. He just throws them around in the same way that people think I'm insane throwing $100 million per Bitcoin around. He's throwing around like 7 billion or 100 billion, and it's yeah. I like yeah. Peter's been a good new friend of mine. We've spoken maybe 5 or 6 hours in total about his thesis. Well, actually, no, more than that probably at this point. But yeah, I've recorded a podcast with him, hopefully, and I hope to release that. It's basically diving more into depth of his methodology. But his whole idea is similar to it's similar to others, but it's expanded on to include derivatives markets and everything else of that sort. So I don't have as much experience, obviously, in accounting as he does. He has a background in that, so I would defer to people with that background. However, with that said, as I've read much of his work and I've listened to his thoughts, I mean, I don't know if it's right. I don't know if he's correct or fully correct, but if there's even a 1% chance that he's correct, it is astronomical. I mean, it's simply absurd. Even if he has a 1 or 5, 10% chance of being correct, it's more than we can possibly fathom. And I think there's a much higher probability he's correct. Maybe it's 10%, maybe it's 90%, but ultimately at the end of the day, that's all you need to know because Peter doesn't know the future. I don't know the future. Jerome Powell doesn't know the future. And ultimately, as someone that's trying to preserve our purchasing power into the future, our priority should be what are the possible paths forward, what are the possibilities, and what's the probability of each of those paths occurring, and then how do I adjust based on that thesis, based on that information. And I think Peter's idea of Bitcoin being used as that like global accounting settlement network, and just all those ideas, which are very far away, but it's truly mind blowing of how high Bitcoin's price in terms of dollars could go, and how much more importantly for people listening, how insignificant all other accounting systems in the history of man could become in comparison to Bitcoin. It's literally like comparing modern banking to Sumerian tablets. It's like, they'll still exist, but they'll be in a museum. So, yeah.
Yeah, Peter has some awesome takes that are like really mind bending, and it makes you really think about what's going to happen with the future of Bitcoin. I'm excited to listen to the podcast you recorded with him. That'd be great. Yeah. We've got him coming back on the Blockware Intelligence podcast. We've got his brother coming on the Blockware Intelligence podcast too. So those will be fantastic episodes. But like thinking back, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and I hope Peter does make the rounds, because I hope people come out and debate him. That's one of the reasons why he wanted to talk to me. He was like, Luke, I have to talk to you. Take a look at this and this, and he sent me a bunch of stuff. It was like, tell me where I'm wrong. Tell me where the thesis is wrong. And as a side note, I think it's what a lot of people outside Bitcoin don't realize. Like, that's why we talk so much, is because we're always trying to figure out where we're wrong. And that's why he wanted to talk to me, and I'm glad. But anyway, I hope he keeps going on these shows, and that people actually debate him that have the education, the background, and the intelligence to, just try to better the thesis and find flaws, because I can't this far, and that's the exciting and terrifying thing. So,
yeah, and I mean, it's his price targets are kind of crazy, but I like generally agree with his thesis and your thesis in that, thinking back to something like 1970, to purchase or to be able to store a terabyte's worth of data may have costed $1 billion back in 1970. It may not even have been possible, right? Now it's like, exactly. You have one right there. It probably costs maybe $100 or so. And it's so like, that's the rate of deflation that has been occurring in certain industries over the last 50 years, but it could be starting to occur in all industries over the next 50 years as technology accelerates faster and faster. And we have this new unit of account where it's the only thing in the world where we can commit infinite amount of time, infinite amount of energy, infinite amount of resources, and we can't make more of it. And when you put it that way and you zoom out on a long enough time horizon, it just seems kind of hard to argue against.
Yeah. And that's ultimately, like I said earlier, that's where my bullish price predictions come from. It's like, 'cause it's like, I'm not a trader. I have no idea. Like, it's just, I'm just taking one step at a time. Like you said, it's like, okay, I have the assumption we can't find a way to destroy this thing. If Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un and, presidents of the United States can't figure out how to kill it, like, I can't figure out how to kill it. So it's like, I take that assumption. It's probably going to survive. Okay. Then I take the assumptions of what makes good money. And then I take the assumption that humanity will continue and not self-destruct and have a prosperous future, and combine it together. It's like, well, the best money absorbs all that productivity, and if this continues to survive, it's the best money. Well, then it should absorb all the. It's really that simple, and that's what has been exciting. When I went to Boston and gave this whole thesis, I was like, that's what's exciting for people to kind of have that click and understand that Bitcoin is not a pessimistic, the US dollar is going to die and, we're going to go back to, blah, 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 and like apocalyptic, dystopian world. It's like, it's inherently, the Bitcoiners inherently are not pessimistic on the world. They're just pessimistic on scams. I mean, so anyway, yeah.
Yeah. And I think like some people would say, like you say, the world is going to get so much more productive. And some people would argue, it's obviously those companies are going to capture that wealth creation. But then you got to look back and argue, yes, that maybe that's happened in the past because people have had no other way to store wealth. So they kind of just stored wealth and equities. But in reality, it's like all of these companies are directly competing with each other, and the profits that they're making, you can't just make profits forever. Like, it's not that easy. Markets are relatively efficient. If someone's making profits, you have 8 billion other people trying to attack and take those profits from you. And it's like, okay, if everyone's competing and everyone's getting insanely productive, where's all of that actual productivity, all that value going to get captured? Well, it's like in the best money, and the best money is
Yeah.
Bitcoin. So you put out a really good thread recently about how to become a millionaire, and it was really interesting because it only required $300 today. Can you explain how this is even possible and what you mean by that?
Stampseed's DIY toolkit gives you the ability to hammer the seed words generated from your Bitcoin hardware wallet into commercial grade titanium plates using professionally designed metal stamping tools. Their plates are fire resistant, crush proof, non corrosive, and will not decay over time, allowing you to hold your Bitcoin securely for the long run. Go to stampseed.com and use the code Blockware15 for 15% off. This offer is valid through May 2023, so get your Stampseed today. Foundation is one of my favorite Bitcoin companies. Their product, Passport, is one of the best Bitcoin hardware wallets on the market. It is air-gapped and highly secure. I strongly encourage you to go to foundationdevices.com and use the code Blockware and get $10 off your Passport. It's a great way to easily and securely store the private keys to your Bitcoin. If you've thrown your hands up trying to run a Lightning node, relax, you're not an idiot. It's not intuitive, and manual management means you won't survive. The guys at Encrypted Energy are fans of the pod and have 20 openings in their private beta for readers to trial automated L&D operations like rebalancing and channel fee management. Email paul@encryptedenergy.com and mention Blockware Intelligence for personalized onboarding.
Yeah, that's one of those things that I'm kind of loving about Twitter because it's like, as my account grows, I get more and more haters and more people that love it. And the bifurcation, I feel, is becoming larger and larger. And that, like a month or two ago, it's like, everyone was like, oh, this is interesting. But now that I'm, being more consistent, people are, I'm getting more and more people that are really into it, more and more people that are like, this is complete. And point being that people can completely miss the point that my thread was how you could become a millionaire for, $275 or, let's just say $300 for the sake of the interview. But for $300, you become a millionaire. And my point was that you could buy a million sats for $300. So yeah, you're not a millionaire in terms of dollars, obviously. Some people didn't get that. But the whole point being, you're a millionaire in terms of sats if that's your definition of money. So anyway, that was the point of the thread. Long story short, was that you could buy a million satoshis, and for those that don't know, hopefully most people watching this know. But in the same way that you have 100 cents in a dollar, you have 100 million satoshis in a Bitcoin. So in the same way that when you're buying a house for $300,000, in our language we don't say I'm buying that house for 30 million cents. We just say I bought it for 300 grand. Because it's easier. In the same way, when you say, I bought a Bitcoin or I bought 10 Bitcoin, what you're really saying is that I bought 100 million Satoshis or I bought a billion Satoshis or half a billion Satoshis or half a million Satoshis. Point being that most people are still have that unit bias of thinking in terms of Bitcoin. But if you just think logically here, if we're right about Bitcoin, the vast majority of humans will never talk in terms of Bitcoin. In the same way that the vast majority of humans don't talk in terms of cents, or they don't talk in terms of trillion-dollar coins or theoretical trillion-dollar coins. It's the same idea that 100 million Satoshis or one Bitcoin is such a astronomically large part of the Bitcoin network that most people, and I would argue most companies, even decently large companies, will probably not have access to that kind of share of the network. So the really, my whole encouragement with the thread was to differentiate, please people think in terms of sats, not Bitcoin, because that's one thing people get hung up on. They think they have to spend $30,000 to buy a whole Bitcoin. It's like, no, you're spending $30,000 for 1/21 millionth of the entire network. It's I didn't say this in a thread, but it's like, what if there were only 21 million cars in the world? What if there were only 21 million websites in the world? What if there were only 21 million houses in the world? And you could divide a car into 100 million parts. You could divide a house into 100 million parts. It's the same idea. You take 21 million of anything useful in the world, and you divide that out, and the probability of picking a random person that happens to own one whole thing of those is so small. It's 21 million, 8 billion people. The odds are like 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 400 or something like that. Point being that was the message of the thread, that you could buy a million Satoshis for roughly $300 today. And if you do the math, Joe, and most people haven't done the math, a million Satoshis is rarer than having $1 million. Like in the future, it will be more difficult to have a million Satoshis than $1 million. Or put in other words, it is better to have a net worth of 100 million. It is better to have a net worth $300 in Bitcoin than $1 million if your time horizon is long enough. As absurd as that sounds, but I mean, if Bitcoin is true, that's the case. That eventually, million sats will be more scarce on a person-to-person basis than $1 million, and so ultimately, every millionaire should buy $300 worth of Bitcoin. But most won't, Joe. And when they start, that's when price inflects upwards, and it only becomes exponentially more difficult to acquire a million Satoshis. And so, as clickbaity as that thread was, I believe it's true. If we assume that Bitcoin's most probable path forward is survival and then therefore success, then yeah, theoretically, you could buy $1 million worth in future dollars worth Bitcoin today for a couple $100. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, everyone needs to be stacking sats. Like that's where the Bitcoin term comes from. Normal people aren't buying full Bitcoins every day. They're buying Satoshis every day. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think like one of the worst counter arguments to Bitcoin is the people that say, oh my gosh, obviously Bitcoin's not scarce because you can divide it into 100 million pieces. And it's like, how are you even like making that argument? It's like, we have one pizza, but we can divide it into a ton of slices. That doesn't mean everyone's gonna be able to eat all the pizza. It's the exact same concept. It's one of the worst arguments against Bitcoin I've ever heard.
Yeah. And that's why I encourage people to ask their financial advisors like basic questions. What is the difficulty adjustment? What is proof of work versus proof of stake? What's the difference between a miner and a node? Because, and again, this isn't to disrespect any individual in any educated position with a PhD and lots more money than I have, but it is to say that most people are approaching us with flawed logic, and that's one of those arguments, Joe, that just is like nails on a chalkboard because it's so illogical. It makes absolutely no sense. It's like, well, stocks aren't scarce because they can just have stock splits. It's like land isn't scarce because we could just divide up parcels infinitely. It's like land's not scarce because you could sell 100 acres or you can sell a millimeter worth of land, so it's not scarce. It's nonsensical. It's like is water. Places in the world have water shortages, and it's like, well, if there's one bottle of water for 10,000 people in this village, well, the water's not scarce because you can infinitely divide it out to the single molecules. It's the same point. It's completely nonsensical. Just because you can divide a finite system into an infinite number of smaller units doesn't mean that it's not fine. Anyway, we've made our point, but that's one of the things that if your financial advisor says that, with all due respect, they aren't thinking this through very reasonably. Because if that's their main argument against Bitcoin, that it's not scarce because you can divide it, well, then you should sell all your stocks, all your gold, all your cash, and all your real estate too, and just own oxygen or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and I think ironically, like they're basically making the argument that they're just extremely bullish on Bitcoin. They're like, actually, no, I could buy one Satoshi and buy it for a ton of money. You're like, okay, well then that just means one Bitcoin is extremely valuable at that point.
Yes.
So
yes. Well, did you see Peter? What's his name? Peter Zeilen or whatever. Yeah. His clip on Joe Rogan. For those that haven't watched it, it's hilarious. But Peter's whole case against Bitcoin is that, well, Bitcoin is designed to appreciate forever, so it's worthless. It should be trading negative. It went viral just because it's like he legitimately believed that. He's continued to bash it since then, and that's his whole point. That money's not supposed to go up in value forever, and Bitcoin, because of its scarce supply, is designed to increase in purchasing power forever, so therefore it's worthless money, and it should be trading negative. And I don't know. It's just stuff I don't understand. And frankly, Joe, for me, that's one of the things that bothers me and makes me wonder if I'm wrong, because it's like there are really smart people out there that in other areas are incredibly intelligent, but then they say something like that. Or like take Elon Musk when he was all about Doge and all about how we got to 10x this, that, and the other. It's like it's just people say things that make absolutely no sense. And um, anyway, that's hard for me to square, because it's like, if I think someone's genuinely believes something and they're smart, yet they say something so dumb. I mean, I've said a lot of dumb stuff before. I've done a lot of dumb stuff before. I get that, but anyway, all that to say is that it is amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the Peter Zion argument is kind of funny. I mean, I understand, I guess his real argument would be that he thinks inflationary money is required for like facilitating economic growth, but it's still like a weird argument, because he's basically saying, actually, well, Bitcoin's going to keep going up, so if for Bitcoin to go up, that means economic growth is positive, right? Like people are buying more, you can buy more things with your Bitcoin. And then he's like, well, economic growth is going to slow once Bitcoin goes up enough. Well, then it's like, okay, well, then the price of Bitcoin will go down relative to everything else, and that kind of solves your problem. So it's like,
But it's a free market, you know.
yeah.
Yeah, price and demand. You change this. You change supply. I mean, the price is correct. It's like, anyway. Yeah, we made our point, and I'm not picking on him alone. I would make that
Yeah.
clear. I have nothing against any of these people alone. It's just the general, frankly, arrogance of modern society that we think we know what money is, when it's like, wait, what if we don't? It's like our it's like societal hubris a mere 150, 200 years ago, when bloodletting was common. But people thought that. I think it was George Washington, right? Didn't he die because doctors, or was
Yeah,
it?
one of something like that. Abraham
Yeah,
Lincoln,
yeah, maybe it
something
was
like that.
Jefferson. I don't remember, but one of the founding fathers was killed because they were, blood. I mean, because they thought, and it was like a collective hallucination that society thought that draining blood of sick patients would cure them. And in the same way, I think it's a collective thing today that we assume we know what money is, and what if we actually all don't? And our grandchildren will look back at us like, "Wow, those people were dumb." But we're modern now in the 22nd century. There's no chance something will come along that disrupts our worldviews. And that's a cycle we keep falling into. We look at past civilizations, we think they look really dumb because they did things in ways that we can't understand, and so we assume we're smarter and that everything we have works. And that's what's happening today with money. And in the future, probably it'll be something else that we can't even predict. So anyway, human nature is a fascinating thing.
Yeah, 100%. Do you think there's such a thing as a escape velocity for Bitcoin?
In terms of nominal price or in terms of adoption,
Either way, what do you think?
I mean, yeah, in terms of nominal price, in any moment there could be escape velocity. Especially, well, the probability of escape velocity in Bitcoin's nominal price is a direct result of the stability of the currency of the nation state in which you reside. Like Argentina, for example, Bitcoin is at all-time highs in terms of the peso. That's another thing people hate me on online. It's like, well, that's just because the peso is going down in value, and it's like, you know, that's the whole point. But yeah, point being that in certain areas of the world, Argentina, Lebanon, Turkey, I think, Pakistan, I think, I can't remember exactly the full list, but there's multiple countries around the world where Bitcoin is going up and up and up, even though in the US and Europe and China and most of the world, it's still, 50%, 60% down in terms of its currency. So yeah, in terms of its nominal currency, there's no limit to how high it could go or how quick it could go, because if that fractional reserve currency you're denominating it within does a First Republic bank and just boom, goes down in the course of 24 or 48 hours or whatever, then yeah, Bitcoin would be the opposite. It would just be trading and then just skyrocket upwards. It's just the inverse of that. So yes, in terms of price, obviously it can happen any moment. Um, but in terms of adoption, I think that's inherently slower, because adoption is printing money is just as easy as adding a few zeros. Adoption requires a lot of time and a lot of work and a lot of education. So yeah, adoption perhaps will have escape velocity, but I think that's a long ways away. I think that's probably at least 5, 10 years away, but there's no guarantee. It might be longer, it might be less. I doubt it's longer though.
Yeah, I agree with that. That was a good take. I mean, adoption will take time, right? Like we
Yes.
do arguably have somewhat decent savings technologies today. Like S&P 500 has historically been a pretty good savings technology. Now we have Bitcoin, which is better. And I think, if you chart the S&P 500 denominated in Bitcoin, the trend is pretty obvious. It's going down forever. I think that will likely continue. But it's just going to be a matter of time for a decade goes by and people are like, wow, again, I should have bought more Bitcoin back then. Like that was obviously the better play. I shouldn't have just speculated and bought a diversified portfolio of every single asset on planet Earth. I should have just concentrated my wealth in this better form of money. So yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I was at a Bitcoin meetup last night. There were half a dozen of us or so, and one of these couples, I was trying to explain the idea of what if diversification becomes obsolete because of Bitcoin. Because up to this point, you diversify. Like the metaphor I gave on your show before of the sinking ships. Up to this point, because the money does nothing but go down, you have to diversify in a mixed basket of assets to survive the money going down. But if the money stays constant in surviving and therefore goes up in value, well, then the assets continue to go down, but they go down in relative terms against the Bitcoin. The productivity gains of society are accurately reflected in Bitcoin, therefore the assets go down. And regarding adoption there, like what you're saying, I think, and this sounds crazy too, but I think most people will be amazed at how high its price in terms of political currency units, dollars, can go with very small adoption rates. Most people think $1 million or $5 million is a high-end long-term future target because, again, like I said earlier, they're thinking in terms of equities and securities. But my question, and frankly my concern, is what happens when Bitcoin hits 1 million, $5 million per coin, and there's still very tiny adoption. There's still a very tiny number of adopters. What's going to happen is the rest of everyone that hasn't adopted yet is going to assume, oh, well, Bitcoin can't go any higher. I remember back when Luke Broyles was buying it at $30,000. He was on the Blockware Solutions podcast, and he was telling me to buy it at $30,000. And man, 2024, 2025, it went up just 50,000, 60,000, 70,000, 80, 90,000, 100,000, 120,000. I guess I'm too late. Should have bought it 30 grand. And then, a few years later, it's going to be $1 million. You and I will still be pounding the table, hopefully, probably, if we're still around, Lord willing. And I'm much less concerned for people about 30 grand to 1 million and much more concerned about what happens after 10 million. Because in terms of if there's ever going to be a point at which the rest of society just capitulates and it's mass adoption and hyperbolic adoption, it's going to be already when Bitcoin is in the millions, tens of millions, or even hundreds of millions. So hyperbolic adoption is nowhere close to today, most probably. So, yeah.
Agree. Let's talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and Bitcoin, right? Like, during the crypto bear market, it seems like everyone that was into crypto has pivoted to artificial intelligence, which is quite hilarious. The Bitcoin community obviously kept trucking along and stacking sats as they know it's the hardest money known to man. But yeah, like let's talk about AI and Bitcoin. How in your mind, do those two, I guess, broad movements in the world and broad technologies in the world, how is that changing humanity and how will it change humanity?
Yeah, that's a funny point you made that the new hype thing is AI. I think a lot of people view Bitcoin as a hype thing or as something, and there is a lot of hype, don't get me wrong, and that's mainly what drives the cycles is hype, a lack of hype or a presence of hype. But yeah, I think the fact that the Bitcoiners are still here, like myself, and saying, no, AI is a component of the thesis for Bitcoin. If you're a Bitcoiner, you understand you don't buy AI stocks, you buy Bitcoin because of the AI. But anyway, point being, how do I think? What you ask? How do I think it plays a part, or where do I think it's
Yeah,
going?
like I guess kind of going back to just our general thesis of like
Yeah,
super high technology growth and Bitcoin being this absolutely scarce asset. I think I saw a tweet the other day. It was pretty interesting how Bitcoin came out at a time when AI is coming out, and AI basically enables you to create endless content, fake endless
yeah,
anything, and create endless, whatever
hmm
knowledge, which could be applied to the real world. And then we have something like Bitcoin where you can't fake it. It's the one thing we know for certain that you can't fake.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think, I think some people think it's a coincidence. I don't know if I particularly think it's a coincidence. I think as technology gets better, both the best tools for freedom and the best tools for censorship are ahead. And so Bitcoin is like the best tool for freedom, and AI is the best tool that could be used for censorship, if it's misused by centralized authority. And so, like, I think in the same way, it's like my metaphor, if we were in the 1930s, we could spend our days being worried about chemical weapons like that were used in World War I, and we can hope and cross our fingers for medicines of the future. It's like, if you're in the 1930s, you can't imagine the medicines that are yet to come, and you can't imagine the weapons are yet to come. And so I think that's largely why we're seeing AI and Bitcoin at the same time. I don't think they're necessarily connected in terms of their origin. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it's just inevitable that as our technology's gotten better and now we have better and better computers, well, of course, we're going to use a computer to a better way to have money and project energy and brute force physical cost, Bitcoin. And we're also going to have a better way to create synthetic computers and synthetic minds. And so, where does that go from here? I mean, AI has been really amazing the last year or so, how much it's developed. Most people are completely unaware of how far AI has come the last couple of years and how far humanoid robots, I think, are coming. Not that they didn't exist before, but they're becoming more and more affordable. Um, and I think ultimately this is a fun thought experiment that I often share with people. I don't know how much I've said it online, but it's like, if right now there are 8 billion humans and all these 8 billion humans are working to create productivity, what's the population going to be in the future? Well, the UN says it's going to be 11 billion, 10 to 11 billion, depending who you ask, by late this century. Many of those children are going to be born in Asia and Africa. But you have, okay, another 3 billion people. So already that's like another third additional number of potential workers on the planet just from humans. Okay, that's a major component, number one. Number two, only 60% of the world is using the internet right now. That's something people don't realize, is that internet's only 60% adoption. So it's like, okay, we are literally going to double the number of internet users in the next, couple decades, at least double. And I think that a major reason why birth rates are falling is because of fiat. As I've explained in Preston's podcast and many other shows, and hopefully people are understanding by now, but it's when you have fiat that's forcing families to have two income households, when people are having to work longer hours, time is linear, the rate of debasement is exponential. You have to have an exponentially number of increasing working hours. People have less children because schooling's more expensive, food's more expensive, housing more expensive, transportation's more expensive, having daycare is more expensive. And, fiat's making all these things more expensive, and it's drastically inflating the cost of raising a child. And so one of my big hopes and assumptions, frankly, is that as the influence of fiat on the world diminishes, that the birth rate will stabilize, perhaps increase, or reach hopefully a healthy level that's more reflective on the ability of humans to produce and consume energy, and less reflective on the rate of monetary debasement. But point being that I think 11 billion by the end of the century, it's probably right. But unlike some people that actually think that the population of the human race is going down under a billion again, population collapse, unlike them, I actually think that probably, population to go up, flatline, perhaps stabilize or whatever, and hopefully beyond there increases. So, let's just, and this is a future thought of mine, I do basically some math, how many humans could the world hold? But let's just say, for the sake of the show, that 20, 30 billion people a long time from now, well outside our lifetimes, but eventually, what if we have, say, 20 billion humans? So, let's say 22nd century sometime, maybe 23rd century, 20, 30 billion humans. Okay, so that's a huge amount of productivity gain. That now we're talking like 5-6x the number of human workers, number one. And number two, because many of them don't use the internet and many of them don't use computers, they'll become more efficient as well. But that's, and I'm coming back down to AI, all of that, which that alone is mind-blowing enough to me personally, that is dwarfed by humanoid robots and AI. Because, let's say that we can have 50% more humanoid robots every year. So let's say there's 1,000 humanoid robots right now that exist. And let's say that increases 50% every year. Well, I think it's like early 2040s. there's only a couple million of them. But even if there are only a couple million of them that are functioning and working 20 years from now, then there's still more humanoid robots by like the late 2060s or the early 2070s than human beings, even if we assume human population continues to grow. And that's mind-blowing to me. That what if we are in the narrow window of human history where humanoid robots and artificial intelligence exists, and it hasn't, and its total thinking power has not yet eclipsed the collective human thinking power. Like, to me, I talk all the time on Twitter about technology windows, and I often compare it with Bitcoin, that we're in the rare time where Bitcoin exists and it's not yet consumed all monetary premium. And it's like the same thing's true with AI, the same thing's true with these robots. What if we're in the period where all these things are growing and they're growing rapidly and they haven't yet taken over everything? So yeah, all I have to say with productivity is, what if in 100 years there are not 8 billion humans, but there's more like 11 to 15 or 20 billion humans, and there's 20 to 30 billion autonomous robots that are doing manual labor and jobs that we don't like. And in addition to that, you have 50 billion or 100 billion synthetic intelligences or unconscious intelligence or artificial intelligence, whatever you want to call them. I mean, it's the whole idea we have less in common with the future than the past. It's taken us, thousands of years to reach 8 billion units of human brains. Well, what if there's hundreds of billions just 100 years from now? And we don't have to wait 100 years to experience society shifting change. And that's one thing that is really important to emphasize. If you're looking from the mid 1800s to the mid 1900s, it's like, that's not one massive transition. That's like half a dozen massive transitions in every industry over that time. And the same thing is true today, that ultimately I have no idea what artificial intelligence would do. Don't ask, nobody should expect me or any of us to know what it's going to do. But I think we should assume that if the technology continues to advance and society continues to move forward, that it's going to have more change on society than the internet, than the nuclear bomb. It should be a really, really big deal. And when that happens is anyone's question, but eventually, probably. So.
Yeah, I definitely agree that, technology is advancing rapidly, faster than ever, and that's going to be a trend that likely will certainly continue. And I also agree about what you were talking about earlier about how fiat has probably been a contributing factor that has prevented more and more people from having kids, right? Or from the population growing at a rapid rate. Because it's like, I think we're the same age now, actually. Because I think it's your birthday today.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so happy birthday.
Thank
But
you.
yeah, I think that it's like our age, 24, is people can't afford houses or anything, right? Like, even if you have a good job and you make good money, you still can't really afford a house unless you were like inherited something. And then if you start tacking on things like student loans and other debt obligations that you've had in the past, or you've had to pay your way through college, or at least pay your part of your way through college, like you're never really going to be able to buy a house in like a decent city. Like, yeah, you could live in a shack in the middle of nowhere, but then where are you actually going to work? And at that point, your job's going to be, not enough to pay for the shack. So it's like, I feel like our generation is like really needs Bitcoin or I want to say something like Bitcoin, but it is Bitcoin, right? Like, people need Bitcoin because otherwise people aren't going to make it. Like, you can live in a 1-bedroom forever, but if you can't afford a house and you can't afford, how are you going to afford kids if you can't afford a house? Like, that's just basic necessities.
Yeah, basic necessities. And that's one thing that people have come back at me with, as the counter argument that, human population can't continue to grow because there's not enough energy, there's not enough, like the reason everything's getting more expensive is because we're running out of room. And, the counter argument to the counter argument, or my argument to the counter argument, is that while there's a possibility that's true, I think the much higher probability is that those people are looking at things through a lens of valuing the US dollar as an absolute value instead of looking through the lens of population. Like if we go back to Roman times, there were 250 million people, something like that. A quarter of a billion, maybe 1/10 of a billion, 100 million people or so around that time. And yeah, if you had a global society in 0 AD that was based on Roman technology, the world would have run out of resources far before we reached today's population, because we were so much less efficient at using energy. We were much less efficient at growing food, at having society function without destroying our natural habitat. And this is why ultimately I don't want to get political, because it's been politicized, but regarding climate change and everything like that, people think climate change is something new, and frankly, it's nothing new. The environment and sustainability and climate is a real issue that needs to be discussed, but this idea that it's a new phenomenon in the last couple decades is frankly extremely ignorant, because every civilization has had this problem that if we keep growing our population, then we will run out of stuff. And the solution every time has been find and innovate a way to increase efficiency and have the net drain on natural resources per human be lower. And so anyway, I think the most probable case for the future is that that continues, and that in the future we'll find ways to harvest energy and spend energy, and we'll have hopefully more people because of it. But at the same time, we can't have population grow too fast, and we especially don't want it to grow too slow. But I think kind of like a free market, the global population should grow as a function of how available do we make energy. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I before we did this podcast, I made a tweet that asked people, I'm having Luke Broyles on again. What questions do you have for him? And a few responses, and this is fair to say, a few responses said, well, Luke, what are the risks to Bitcoin? Like, what's your bearish scenario? Which I think is totally fair. So I do want to hear your thoughts on this. Like, what's the bearish case for Bitcoin?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I've been asked that on a couple other shows, and every time I say that's like such a good question, because it's like that's the question. I was in Boston for a week, and most of that week was work related. I did some fun things with people. We went to Fenway Park and all that, but pretty much the whole time it was just peers and I. We were just discussing what are the possible ways in which Bitcoin could die, or adoption is slowed, or it's stopped, or how are we wrong? Because ultimately, my incentive is that if Bitcoin's true, it could save millions of lives, and so I want to do everything I can to defend that and protect that. And so anyway, it's a really good question, and for me, I can't find something that is an extremely convincing counter argument. I think there are real threats. I think one of them is an EMP or CME, something that takes out the global grid. Yes, you don't need the internet per se to exchange in Bitcoin, but let's be honest, adoption is slow enough right now. Like if the internet went out, the immediate needs of food, energy, survival would be much greater than Bitcoin. However, the reality is that eventually the grid would come back. Again, if we're assuming that humanity doesn't turn into Mad Max, and and then in that case, then Bitcoin survives. So it's like in that case, it's not even really something that stopped or killed Bitcoin. It's just a major event that became a much larger concern. Because right now, our number one societal concern should be fixing the money. Obviously, if there's something that stops all food production, that supplants that. But then as soon as that's fixed, then Bitcoin just comes back, and its adoption, I think, would not be slowed at all. So, I mean, that is possible. I mean, ultimately, I think war is probably the most pessimistic outcome, even more than a CME or even more than the grid going out. I think war is pessimistic, because with the grid, everyone will be working together to fix it. But with war, it's the incentives are very different. But I mean, yeah, that seems to me to be the largest practical concern, or most probable significant concern. However, there's also always a chance that there's a bug in Bitcoin's code, or there's some flaw in it. However, as I've said before, Vladimir Putin's not figured it out. The CIA's not figured it out. Joe Biden's not figured it out. Trump's not figured it out. Clinton's not figured it out. The Taliban's not figured it out. The Chinese Communist Party, it's like, basically, in order to believe that there was a bug in there and everyone's just waiting to exploit it when it gets valuable, it's like you're basically assuming that every institution, government, individual, and billionaire, you're basically assuming everyone on Earth is somehow in collusion, that we all know there's a way at which it can't be destroyed, and none of us are going to exploit that. So, I mean, yeah, there's a possible unknown, but I don't know. I can't figure it out. I'd like to ask you the same thing. What do you think is the biggest downside against Bitcoin? Because I'm war obviously is said that I just said, but I think ultimately it's just fear, uncertainty, and doubt is the biggest. It's just misinformation and mistruths and lies about this. I think are the best weapon against truth, because I think if you say anything true against the greater truth, that you just revealed that you're a fraud, I guess. So anyway, I think we're actually in it right now. I think all these misinformation campaigns against Bitcoin are probably the single largest inhibitor against adoption. Because, okay, let's say they try to censor it. Well, every time they censor it in other places, adoption goes up. So it's like, you know, I don't know. That's just my off the cuff thoughts about that. But I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think imperfect humans are probably the biggest threat to Bitcoin, right? Like
Yeah.
everyone is going to make mistakes and everyone is going to be fallible, and that can lead to things like war where there's just massive destruction. And then, at that point, you don't really necessarily need money. You need food and bullets and whatnot. And so that's obviously a major concern. Other than that, I would say some sort of like bug in cryptography itself, like the math is just somehow broken. And I don't think that even makes sense. I'm not a cryptographer by any means, but I could see that being a scenario because there can certainly be bugs in Bitcoin, and there have been bugs in Bitcoin, but they get patched and that doesn't kill Bitcoin. So it would have to be like a very specific bug in Bitcoin. It'd have to be like, okay, anyone in the world can immediately find a private key from a public key, which is basically like breaking elliptic curve cryptography itself, which is my understanding, basically breaking mathematics itself as we know it today. And so it's like, if that's somehow possible, then yes, then that's a huge threat to Bitcoin. But at the end of the day, Bitcoin is just a ledger system. It's a perfectly scarce ledger system. That system can be, ported over to other software technologies. The way we interact with that ledger is just, we call it Bitcoin today. It's Bitcoin Core is the network. We use specific like software to interact with this ledger, but that software can change over time. I don't think it will change anytime soon because I think Bitcoin's already works pretty well. But theoretically, at the end of the day, money is just a ledger. It's just kind of a tool that people are using, and so that tool that we use to interact with the ledger could change. But I think the initial units are going to be what we originally knew as Bitcoin, because it's hard to. I think it's probably impossible to improve perfect scarcity. Like it's like the number zero that Robert Breedlove talks about. It's like you can't really make another number zero. We have already created it. And so now that it exists, it's like the things around it can change and we can have different tools interacting with the number zero, but it's still the number zero, and Bitcoin is still Bitcoin.
Yeah. That's very philosophical there. We probably just lost some people, but yeah, that makes, to me, that makes a lot of sense. That it's really profound. And it's like, like I mentioned earlier, it's like most of the bugs in Bitcoin were like all the way back in 2011, 2012, and there were like maybe 1,000 people that we were using, or a few thousand people, let's say. um, so it's like it was tiny, and like there hasn't been, at least as far as I can tell, there's been nothing significant. I mean, maybe the ordinals thing is, but I don't know. To me, that doesn't seem nearly as significant as the early bugs. But point being that even if there is a 10% chance that there's an exploitable hack in Bitcoin and somebody figures it out with some future technology, it's like, okay, we can't envision that yet, so it's probably a ways away. Number one. But then number two, again, what's the probability that a fractional reserve system dies before we figure out how to kill Bitcoin? It's like, I think well over 90%. I mean, as we've seen with everything else as we started the conversation, it's like the probability of fractional reserve systems dying is very high. And so even if there's eventually an exploitable weakness to a full reserve system, like it just makes so much more sense to own that, because at least you're owning something that's probably not going to collapse in the meantime between now and then because it was violating that. So
Yeah, exactly. if you're really thinking about like the future uncertainties around Bitcoin, it's like, okay, you can consider cryptography breaking as a future uncertainty, but it's like, if you're really thinking about future uncertainties around other financial assets that you hold, there's a lot more future uncertainties, and there's certainly different future uncertainties that, that don't even really apply to Bitcoin, that
No.
apply to
Yeah.
real estate, equities, US Treasuries, whatnot.
Gold.
So yeah, it's fascinating to think about. But I think this is probably a great spot to wrap it up. I know we've been already going for over an hour now. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to leave the audience with?
Oh man, there were things I wanted to ask you too. That's all right. Yeah, no, I don't know if I particularly have any. Well, sure. Yeah, it just is getting off zero is just the big thing. It's like this whole point of you can buy a million satoshis for $300, 1% of a Bitcoin, or emphasizing that your S&P 500 went down 1% because a single bank, one bank that wasn't even the top 10 went under because it's a fractional reserve system. Like you won't even allocate 1% to Bitcoin, even though your S&P 500 just lost 1%. It's all these things. You and I, we're just trying to say the same thing, that Bitcoin is this new thing, and many of us, almost all of us, ignored it for a very long time, and we've all come full circle to realize, oh, wait a second, this isn't some get rich quick thing where I'm going to make a bunch of money and kind of like a multi-layer marketing or a Ponzi scheme or whatever. It's like, no, the beauty of Bitcoin is that it has no yield. It isn't fractional reserve. There is no multi-level marketing. It's just a full reserve system that is free and open to all, and it has dominated all competing full reserve systems out there in the world, and we don't know how to stop it, and we can't even conceive of a backdoor which a corrupted human being could exploit for their own benefit. Maybe there is, but we can't find it yet. And that's a really big deal. And the theoretical value of that, as Peter Dunworth and you and me would all bullishly say, the value of that to society and the number of lives that would save and the amount of corruption and distortion that would reduce is almost incalculable. And because of that, because of the fact it's going to bring benefit to society, and because of the fact that everyone's going to prefer it, because it's just so much better than everything else, that's why stupidly high prices in terms of everything else are inevitable. And again, I've said this before, but it's worth saying again that if Bitcoin is correct, every exchange rate with the fiat currency is stupidly cheap. It's like saying, what's the exchange rate between gold and seashells, or between gold and some other ancient money? It's like, if there is a large market if there's a large seashell I'm tripping up there on seashells, but if there's a large market for the ancient money and the future money, well, then you know that the future money inherently is extremely cheap because the old thing still exists. It's like saying, that most people still use horses, but the locomotive is still around. Well, you can therefore tell that it's very early in the days of the locomotive and eventually the automobile, when most people are still using horses. And likewise today, I strongly believe Bitcoin will be $30,000, as it's like $28,000 right now, and then it'll be 40,000, 50,000, 80,000, 100,000, million, 10 million. It's like every exchange rate with the dollar theoretically should be passed as Bitcoin supplants the dollar. Even $100 million, or like Peter would say, $7 billion or $70 billion. I mean, we have a very hard time conceptualizing what's really going on here. And it's very exciting to be invited to things like this, talk to people like you, Joe, and talk about the future with people and appreciate the present moment in light of where we are in the human story. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. And on that idea of imperfect humans, I mean, the invention of Bitcoin was taking the future supply schedule out of the hands of humans, right? Every other asset in the world, it's more easier for humans to manipulate or change or increase the future supply of that asset. The invention of Bitcoin is attempting in the best way possible to take that future supply out of the control of any single human, or even any large group of humans. That's what's so unique and special about Bitcoin. But yeah, no, Luke, thanks so much for coming on. We'll eventually have to get you on for part 3. This is awesome.
Well, hey, Joe, actually, before we go, how many
Yeah.
banks do you think will go belly up between now and our next podcast? We should have that bet. We should guess that. How many fractional
That's
reserve systems are going to die between now and the next thing? Just to have fun with the fiat maxis.
Yeah. I mean, it's
Pick a
such a good
number.
question. I feel like it just depends, right? Like we saw with previous banks, they basically got a bailout or got acquired or whatnot, and I feel like that's going to somewhat happen again if things get bad enough. So I definitely expect turbulence, right? Like I don't know what the number of banks having extreme issues like
Yeah.
First Republic will be, but I expect turbulence, but I also expect them to eventually step in a big way to stop it. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. It's anyone's guess. I don't know. Maybe at least one. We'll see. I wasn't expecting any last time, so I don't know. Maybe there's none, but maybe there's 50. We'll see. So anyway,
Fair, fair.
yeah, we'll see what happens in the world. So talk to you soon. Yep.
Fair,
Thanks.
totally. Well, thanks everybody for watching. You'll have to stay tuned for part 3 at some point.